At a busy warehouse in Chicago, a black man finally has the opportunity to be promoted after 12 years of work. All he has to do is show up for an important meeting. But he loses that rare chance when he decides to miss the meeting to help a wounded elderly woman he doesn't even know. As a result, not only does he not get promoted, but he is also fired. Lying in despair, not knowing how to manage his life and afford his mother's treatment, he suddenly receives a phone call, the call from the very person he had just helped. A call that will change his life forever. The rain fell in a steady, relentless rhythm against the warehouse's metal roof, creating a dull, rhythmic hum that blended with the distant rumble of truck engines. It was another bleak morning at Midwest Freight Logistics, another day of heavy lifting, sweat-stained uniforms, and a silent, unspoken hierarchy that had never favored men like Marcus Bennett. For 12 years, he had given this place everything: his time, his strength, his back that ached every night as he collapsed into the worn-out couch in the small apartment he shared with his mother. But today wasn't just another day. Today was supposed to be the day that changed everything. He adjusted the sleeves of his navy blue uniform, the fabric rough and stiff with years of wear. The patch on his chest bore his name in fading white thread. M. Bennett, a small, insignificant label in a place that had always seen him as just another pair of hands. But not today. Today was his chance to be seen. For the first time since he started at this warehouse, Marcus had a shot at something more than just moving crates and following orders. 10 a.m. That was the moment. That was the meeting that could take him out of the loading docks and into an office, his chance to finally be promoted to warehouse supervisor. It was the position he had been waiting for 12 long years, a position that meant a steady salary, benefits for his mother's medical bills, no more 10-hour shifts in the freezing cold or suffocating heat. No more being dismissed as if he were invisible. The corporate executives were coming in person today to interview him. Him. Not one of the younger, newer hires who had been promoted over him before. Not one of the men Callahan played golf with on weekends. Marcus. He had worked harder than any of them. Had shown up every single day for over a decade. Never complained, never took shortcuts. Today was supposed to prove that all of it meant something. But Callahan, his supervisor, his obstacle, his reality check, had made one thing clear that morning. "If you screw this up, Bennett, don't come crying to me. I told them you were worth considering, but don't make me regret it. And for God's sake, don't be late. They're giving you a chance they don't usually hand out to guys like you." Marcus had clenched his jaw at that last part, at the way Callahan's voice dripped with that familiar condescension, that thinly veiled message that Marcus had no business aiming for anything higher than the floor he spent all day walking on. He had heard it all before. He had lived it. He had felt it every time a white coworker was promoted over him, despite having less experience. Every time his ideas were ignored in meetings, every time he was reminded explicitly or otherwise that people like him should be grateful just to have a job at all. 9:40 a.m. Marcus stood near the loading dock, clipboard in hand, running through his mental checklist. Everything was set. The trucks were aligned, the inventory was accounted for, and all he had to do now was head upstairs, shake hands, smile, and convince a room full of men in pressed suits that he belonged there. But as he turned toward the main floor, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. An elderly woman, frail, hunched against the cold, was making her way slowly toward the customer pickup counter. The rain had drenched her thin gray coat, and her steps were unsteady, her small frame shivering beneath the weight of the wind. She clutched a receipt in trembling fingers, her eyes scanning the area, searching for help. A gust of wind ripped through the open dock doors, knocking a caution, wet floor sign onto its side. Marcus's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. "Mom, you okay?" he called out instinctively, stepping toward her. She barely had time to glance up before her foot slipped against the slick concrete, her frail body collapsing hard onto the ground with a sharp, painful cry. Everything in Marcus froze except his pulse, which thundered in his ears like a war drum. His muscles tensed, torn between two realities colliding all at once. If he helped her, he would miss the meeting. If he left her there, he would have to live with it. He turned toward the warehouse clock, 9:45 a.m. The rain beat against the pavement, pooling around the woman's small, shivering frame. No one else moved. No one else cared. Callahan's voice echoed in his head. Don't be late. 9:46 a.m. The woman whimpered, trying to lift herself, but her arms shook under her own weight. Marcus felt something twist inside him. Something deep, something immovable. 9:47 a.m. He exhaled sharply, closed his eyes for half a second, then he moved. Marcus dropped his clipboard onto a crate without a second thought and ran. His boots splashed through the rain-soaked pavement as he knelt beside the elderly woman, her breath coming in sharp, pained gasps. Her frail hands clutched at her hip, her face contorted in agony. "Mom, don't move, okay? Just breathe," Marcus said, steady but urgent, his own breath quickening as he took in the sight of her, the thinness of her frame, the way the rain clung to the wrinkles on her face like she'd been out here too long, unnoticed, forgotten. She blinked up at him through the haze of pain, eyes glassy with shock. I think I hurt my hip," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the storm. Marcus winced. He had seen enough warehouse accidents to know that a fall like that, at her age, wasn't just a bruise. "You're gonna be okay. I'm calling for help." He shrugged off his jacket, gently draping it over her trembling form as he reached for his phone. His fingers, damp from the rain, fumbled slightly as he punched in 911. The dispatcher picked up on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? "I have an elderly woman. Looks like a bad fall. She's conscious but says her hip is injured. We're at Midwest Freight Logistics, loading dock area. She needs an ambulance now." "Understood, sir. Stay with her. Help is on the way." He hung up, turning his attention back to the woman as the cold rain continued to pour, soaking through his uniform. He could feel the minutes slipping away like sand through his fingers. 9:50 a.m. His stomach clenched. The meeting. He glanced toward the warehouse entrance, toward the hallway that led to the conference room where the corporate executives were waiting. If he left now, if he ran, maybe he could still make it. Maybe he could help her and still save himself. Maybe. "Please don't leave," the woman whispered, gripping his sleeve. Marcus stilled. He swallowed hard, pushing away the rising panic in his chest. No, he wasn't leaving her. But someone else could help. He turned his head, scanning the warehouse floor. Dozens of workers moved about, some stacking boxes, others clocking in and out, but not a single one was looking in their direction. No one was coming. No one had even stopped to see what was wrong. Marcus's jaw tightened. He knew what this was. He had seen it before. This wasn't just indifference. It was calculated. These men weren't blind. They saw. They just didn't care. Not about an old woman. Not about Marcus. And certainly not about whether either of them needed help. A sharp voice cut through the rain. "Bennett." Marcus turned just as Callahan stormed toward him, clipboard in hand, his expensive boots splashing against the wet pavement. His face was already red with irritation, his expression twisted in a way that made it painfully clear he already knew exactly what was happening. "What the hell are you doing?" Callahan barked. "You're supposed to be in that damn meeting right now." Marcus rose slowly to his feet, his shirt clinging to his soaked skin, his heart still hammering. "She fell. She's hurt. I already called an ambulance." Callahan's eyes darted to the woman on the ground, his mouth curling in barely concealed disgust, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Christ, Bennett. That's not your problem. You're throwing away the best chance you'll ever get over." He gestured toward her carelessly. Some old lady who should have been watching where she was going. Marcus felt something flare hot inside him. "She could have broken her hip," he said, voice low, controlled but dangerous. Callahan scoffed, rubbing a hand down his face like this entire situation was exhausting. "Jesus, this is exactly why I told them you weren't ready for this promotion." Marcus's pulse skipped. "What?" Callahan crossed his arms, tilting his head, studying Marcus the way a man studies something he's already made up his mind about. "Look, let's not pretend here. I vouched for you, sure, but we both know this was a long shot. And now?" He huffed out a humorless laugh. "You really think the executives upstairs are going to pick someone who couldn't even bother to show up on time?" Marcus felt his chest tighten. He had worked 12 years for this. 12 years of showing up early, of working harder than anyone else, of being overlooked, ignored, passed up, but never stopping, never quitting. He had earned this shot. And yet, one choice, one moment, and it was gone. "You're done, Bennett," Callahan said, shaking his head like he was almost disappointed. "Might as well start packing your locker now." The words hit harder than they should have. Marcus had known what this decision would cost him. He had made peace with it. But hearing it out loud, knowing that Callahan hadn't even hesitated to throw him away over something like this, it still stung. "Go back inside, Bennett." "Last chance," Callahan said, tapping his watch impatiently. Marcus looked down at the elderly woman, scared, vulnerable, clutching onto the only person who had bothered to see her. And then he looked back at Callahan, who had already decided that she wasn't worth the time. The choice wasn't even a choice anymore. "I'm staying with her," Marcus said, voice firm, steady, unshaken. Callahan stared at him for a long moment, then let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Yeah, that's what I thought." He pulled a pen from his pocket, clicked it with a deliberate finality, and scribbled something onto his clipboard. "You're terminated." Marcus exhaled slowly, chest rising and falling with the weight of the words. He should have been angry. He should have felt regret. But as he turned his back on Callahan, as he knelt once more beside the old woman, as he squeezed her frail hand in reassurance, he didn't. Because at the end of the day, he still had himself. And no promotion, no paycheck, no title in the world was worth losing that. The rain had eased to a light drizzle by the time the ambulance arrived, its flashing red lights cutting through the dull gray sky. The paramedics moved quickly, wrapping the elderly woman in a thermal blanket, speaking to her in hushed, reassuring tones. Marcus stayed by her side, steadying her as they lifted her onto the stretcher, his own clothes soaked through, the cold biting into his skin. He barely noticed. His mind was still processing what had just happened, the finality of Callahan's words, the weight of everything he had just lost. "Sir, are you a relative?" one of the paramedics asked, adjusting the straps on the stretcher. "No," Marcus replied, shaking his head. "She was alone when she fell. I couldn't leave her like that." The woman, still clutching his jacket over her shoulders, turned her head weakly toward him. "Thank you, son. I'm so sorry you got in trouble for this." Marcus forced a small, tight smile. "Don't worry about that, ma'am. Just focus on getting better." But as he said the words, the reality of what came next began to sink in. His job was gone. His paycheck. His mother's medical insurance. There was no safety net, no backup plan, just the slow realization that the only thing keeping him from absolute panic was the fact that he had no time to fall apart. Not yet. "Can someone call your family, ma'am?" the paramedic asked gently. The woman frowned slightly, as if struggling to remember something. I think my son is expecting me soon." She reached for her purse with trembling fingers, but Marcus saw how badly her hands were shaking. Without thinking, he reached down and gently picked up the phone she was struggling to grab. The screen was still unlocked. The last incoming call, Ethan Carter. Marcus hesitated for only a moment before pressing the redial button. The phone rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Mom? You okay?" Marcus cleared his throat. Hi, this is Marcus Bennett. Your mother had a fall outside the Midwest Freight Logistics warehouse. She's conscious, but the paramedics are taking her to the hospital now. You should come as soon as you can." A pause. Then, "Who are you?" "Just someone who was there," Marcus said simply. There was another pause, short, clipped, unreadable. Then, "Which hospital?" Marcus turned to the paramedic, who gave him the name. He relayed it into the phone. Ethan hung up without another word. The paramedics finished their assessment and prepared to move her. As they wheeled her toward the ambulance, she reached out one last time, squeezing Marcus's wrist with surprising strength. "You're a good man," she whispered. Marcus could only nod as he stepped back, watching as they loaded her inside. And then, just like that, she was gone. The lot was nearly empty now, the warehouse looming behind him like a monument to everything he had lost in the span of a single hour. His hands clenched at his sides. He needed to try. His boots felt heavier with every step as he walked back toward the employee entrance, past the same loading dock where this all began. He had to at least talk to Callahan again, had to at least try to convince him he couldn't afford to lose this job. He pushed open the side door, his heart pounding, his mind racing through what he could possibly say. He spotted Callahan near the break room, talking to another supervisor, laughing about something. The sound of it so casual, so damn easy made Marcus's stomach churn. Swallowing his pride, he forced himself to approach. "Callahan, can we talk?" Callahan turned, raising an eyebrow like he was surprised Marcus was still here. "For what?" "You don't have to fire me," Marcus said, hating how desperate the words sounded but knowing he had no choice. "I know I messed up, but you know I'm a hard worker. I've never missed a shift in 12 years. There has to be another way to fix this." Callahan sighed, rubbing his temple like Marcus was an inconvenience he didn't have the energy to deal with. "Look, Bennett, I already made my decision. The XX were here. You weren't. You knew the stakes, and you still made your choice. I don't know what you want me to do about it." "I just need my job, man," Marcus said, voice tight. "My mother, she's sick. I need the insurance. I need the paycheck. I can't walk away from this." For a moment, Callahan just looked at him, and Marcus hoped he might reconsider. Then Callahan shook his head, chuckling under his breath. "That's not my problem, Bennett." Marcus's stomach dropped. "Come on, man," he tried again, his voice dangerously close to breaking. "You know I didn't plan for this to happen. You know I wouldn't have just skipped the meeting if it wasn't serious." Callahan just shrugged. "You should have thought about that before you played hero." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Marcus had known this was coming, but somehow, hearing it still made it feel worse. Like it had all been a foregone conclusion the second he stepped away from his station. "You really firing me over this?" he asked quietly. One last attempt, one last plea. Callahan sighed again, rolling his eyes. "I already told you go pack your locker." And just like that, it was over. His hands still trembled from the conversation with Callahan, from the way his boss had barely even looked at him, before tossing him aside like he was nothing. He could still hear his own voice in his head, raw with desperation, begging for a second chance, a chance that was never going to come. "You should have thought about that before you played hero." Marcus exhaled sharply, forcing the words out of his mind. It didn't matter now. None of it did. As he turned toward the exit, footsteps echoed against the concrete floor. Slow, purposeful. Marcus looked up. A man stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, sharp eyes fixed on him. The same man who had arrived at the hospital minutes after his mother, Ethan Carter. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "I heard you talking to your boss." His voice was even, unreadable. Marcus sighed, adjusting his bag over his shoulder. "Yeah? And?" Ethan took another step forward. "You just said you lost your job." Marcus huffed out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, guess I did." He met Ethan's gaze, something defiant in his stance, something daring him to say what he already knew. "I was just trying to help your mother, man. But I guess that doesn't count for much in a place like this." Ethan didn't react right away. His expression didn't shift, didn't soften. But something flickered behind his eyes, something Marcus couldn't quite place. A long silence stretched between them. Then Ethan gave a small nod, his face carefully neutral. "I see." He didn't say anything else. And for some reason, that was worse. Marcus let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter anyway." And with that, he turned and walked out, the weight of the rain pressing down on his shoulders as he stepped into the cold. Marcus sat at the small kitchen table, his elbows resting on the worn wooden surface, his head in his hands. The apartment was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator, the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. His mother was asleep in the next room, unaware of the storm brewing inside him. He had walked home in the rain, his work bag feeling heavier than ever, the reality of his situation pressing down on his shoulders like an unbearable weight. 12 years. Gone. He had spent the evening staring at job postings, his laptop screen glowing dimly in the darkened room. But every listing looked the same: entry-level warehouse work, minimum wage, no benefits, no stability. None of them could replace what he had lost today. None of them could ensure his mother had the medication and care she needed. Marcus ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. He had done the right thing. He knew that, but knowing it didn't make this any easier. Then his phone rang. He frowned, pulling it from his pocket. Unknown number. For a second, he considered ignoring it, but something in his gut told him to answer. Marcus Bennett. The voice was smooth, calm, authoritative. A woman. Yeah, who's this? My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm calling from Carter Global Enterprises. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning. Marcus blinked, gripping the phone tighter. Carter Global. The name hit him like a shock to the system. I think you've got the wrong person. I'm just a warehouse worker. No mistake, Mr. Bennett, she replied evenly. You're exactly the person we're looking for. A car will be outside your apartment at 8 a.m. The address has already been sent to your phone. Before he could ask another question, the line went dead. Marcus stared at the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. This had to be some kind of mistake. But as he set the phone down, something flickered in his chest, a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next morning, Marcus stood outside his apartment, shifting uncomfortably in his best button-down shirt, which, in reality, was just the least worn-out one he owned. He still wasn't sure if this was real. Then, right on time, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, opening the back door for him without a word. Marcus hesitated. Then he climbed inside. The ride was silent, the city passing by in a blur. They drove past neighborhoods he had never set foot in, streets lined with towering office buildings and pristine storefronts. This was a world he didn't belong to. Or at least, that's what he had always been told. The car finally pulled into the underground garage of a massive glass skyscraper, Carter Global Enterprises. Marcus swallowed hard. The driver opened his door. They're waiting for you upstairs, sir. Marcus stepped out, adjusting his sleeves, his pulse pounding as he entered the lobby. A receptionist guided him to an elevator, then up to the top floor. When the doors slid open, he stepped into a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And there, standing at the head of the table, was Ethan Carter. Marcus stiffened. You, he said flatly. Ethan smirked slightly. Me. Before Marcus could respond, another voice entered the room. And me, a woman said. Marcus turned to see Margaret Carter, the elderly woman he had helped at the warehouse. But she wasn't hunched over in pain now. She stood tall, exuding a quiet authority, her sharp eyes watching him with interest. Surprised? She asked, a faint smile touching her lips. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. I don't even know what to think anymore. Ethan gestured to a chair. Sit. We have something to discuss. Marcus hesitated. Then, cautiously, he took a seat. Ethan leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. I told you yesterday that I heard everything. But what I didn't tell you is that I run Midwest Freight Logistics, the warehouse you worked at. That's my division, which means Callahan worked for me, and after what I saw, he doesn't anymore. Marcus's jaw tensed. You fired him. Immediately, Ethan confirmed, which leaves me with a vacancy, and a decision to make. Marcus frowned. What's that got to do with me? Margaret spoke this time. Everything. She studied him carefully, her voice softer now. Yesterday you lost your job helping me. You didn't have to. You knew what it would cost you, but you did it anyway. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. That tells me exactly the kind of man you are. And that's the kind of man we need. Marcus swallowed, his throat tight. For what? Ethan slid a folder across the table. To run our new community outreach program. To help people like you, people who work hard, who deserve better, who just need someone to give them a chance. Marcus's hands hovered over the folder. It's yours if you want it, Ethan said. Full salary. 3 times what you made at the warehouse. Full benefits. Health care for your mother, starting today. And a new place, close to the office. No more worrying about making ends meet. No more working yourself into the ground for people who don't see you. Marcus couldn't speak. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contract. It was real. All of it. "Why me?" he whispered. Margaret smiled. "Because when no one else did, you saw me as a person, not an inconvenience. And that is something money can't buy." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. Then, with steady hands, he picked up the pen and signed. 3 months later. Marcus adjusted the cuffs of his new suit, a sharp, well-fitted navy piece that still felt foreign on his skin but belonged to him now. He stepped into the conference room of Carter Global's headquarters, the polished floors gleaming under the morning light. Dozens of new hires sat in front of him, men and women who had been given a second chance, just like him. "Welcome to Carter Community Outreach," Marcus said, his voice steady, strong. "We're here to change lives. And trust me, I know exactly how much that matters." He caught sight of his mother through the glass panel, talking with a group of employees, her laughter soft but full of something he hadn't seen in years. Peace. Outside, across the city skyline, the Midwest Freight Logistics warehouse stood in the distance. But it was no longer a place of loss. It was just a beginning. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.